My name is Ezra Castellanos, and I'm a tower technician who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted, I was 300 feet up a communications tower watching civilization collapse beneath me. The ash blocked out the sun, temperatures dropped 40 degrees, and within days everyone I knew was either dead or missing. I had to choose between freezing to death alone or risking everything to reach other survivors 200 miles south through the deadliest blizzards in human history. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you about October 15th, 2024. That was the day I realized my job as a telecommunications tower technician had just become the most important skill on the planet. My name is Ezra Castellanos, and for 15 years I had been climbing towers across Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, maintaining the communication networks that kept people connected. I thought I had seen everything in this line of work. I was wrong. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I got the emergency maintenance call at 6:30 in the morning from dispatch. Tower 77 Alpha near Rabbit Ears Pass had lost primary power overnight, and with a storm system moving through the area, they needed someone up there to switch the backup systems manually and check for weather damage. It was a 300-foot tower, sitting on a ridge about 20 miles from the nearest town. Not an unusual assignment for me. I had climbed that particular tower maybe a dozen times over the years. I loaded my truck with the standard gear: safety harness, climbing equipment, toolkit, emergency radio, and my survival pack. Company policy required us to carry 3 days' worth of food and water when working remote sites. I always packed extra, because you never know when weather might trap you somewhere longer than expected. I grabbed some extra batteries for my equipment and threw in an additional blanket. The weather report mentioned possible snow at higher elevations, which was not uncommon for October in the Colorado Rockies. The drive to the tower site took about 2 hours through winding mountain roads. I remember listening to the radio during the drive, catching bits of news about some unusual seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park. Scientists had been monitoring increased earthquake swarms and thermal activity for weeks. There was talk about raising the alert level, but the experts kept reassuring everyone that eruptions typically gave much more warning. I did not think much of it at the time. Yellowstone had been having minor earthquakes and thermal changes for decades without anything major happening. I reached the tower site around 9 in the morning. The access road was rough, just a dirt track that wound up through pine trees to a small clearing where the tower stood. 300 feet of steel lattice stretching up into the cloudy sky, with microwave dishes and antennas mounted at various levels. The equipment building at the base was about the size of a large shed, housing batteries, power systems, and backup generators. Everything looked normal from the ground. I did my standard pre-climb safety check, inspected my harness, tested my radio, verified my climbing equipment was properly secured. The wind was picking up, but nothing I had not worked in before. I started my ascent at 9:30, clipping my safety lines to the tower's ladder system as I climbed. At 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, I stopped at each equipment platform to check connections and power systems. The view from 250 feet up was spectacular. I could see for miles across the mountain valleys with snow-capped peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. The air was thin and cold but clear. I had always loved this part of the job. There was something peaceful about being up so high, above the noise and chaos of the world below. I had no idea I was about to witness the end of that world. I was working on the backup power transfer switch at the 250-foot level when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just an unusual cloud formation on the western horizon. A massive dark column rising straight up into the sky, much higher than any normal cloud. It looked almost like a tornado, but perfectly vertical and incredibly tall. I stopped what I was doing and stared at it for several minutes, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Then my radio crackled to life. Emergency broadcasts started flooding the frequencies. The National Weather Service, emergency management, news stations all talking at once about a major volcanic eruption at Yellowstone National Park. The dark column I was seeing was an ash plume rising 20 miles into the atmosphere. The Yellowstone supervolcano had erupted for the first time in over 600,000 years. From my position on the tower, I had a front row seat to watch the ash cloud spread across the sky. It moved faster than I expected, carried by high-altitude winds. Within an hour, the western horizon had turned completely black, and the cloud was still expanding. The radio chatter became increasingly frantic as reports came in from across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Cities were being evacuated. Airports were shutting down. The interstate highway system was clogged with people trying to flee the ashfall zone. I should have climbed down immediately and headed home to Denver. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I found myself, frozen in place, mesmerized by the scale of what I was witnessing. This was not just a natural disaster, this was a civilization-ending event, and I was watching it unfold from 300 feet in the air with the best vantage point probably, within hundreds of miles. The first ash started falling around noon. It looked like gray snow, except it was warm and gritty and got into everything. My radio equipment started picking up distress calls from aircraft trying to land with ash-clogged engines. Emergency. Services were overwhelmed. The governor of Wyoming declared a state of emergency and ordered the evacuation of everything within a 200-mile radius of the park. By mid-afternoon, the ashfall was getting heavy enough that I could barely see the ground below the tower. The temperature had dropped noticeably, even though we were still getting some sunlight. I finally decided it was time to get down, but when I started my descent, I realized the situation was much worse than I had thought. The ash was coating everything, making the tower rung slippery and reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. I made it down safely, but when I got to my truck, I discovered the first real sign of how bad things were going to get. The ash had clogged the air filter and gotten into the engine intake. The truck would barely start, and when it did run, it sounded terrible. I managed to drive about 5 miles down the access road before the engine started overheating and losing power. I was going to be stuck at the tower site, at least until I could figure out how to get the vehicle running properly. That first night, camped in my truck with the heater running, I monitored the radio frequencies and started to understand the scope of what was happening. The ash cloud had spread across most of the western United States. Commercial aviation was completely shut down. Power plants were going offline as ash clogged their air intake systems. The electrical grid was becoming unstable across multiple states. But the really disturbing reports were coming from meteorologists and climate scientists. They were talking about something called volcanic winter. The ash and sulfur dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere would block sunlight and cause global temperatures to drop. Similar eruptions in the past had triggered ice ages. They were predicting temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit across the northern hemisphere, lasting for years. I woke up on the second morning to find frost covering my truck, even though it was still October. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. In Colorado, that was not unheard of for late October, but combined with the continuing ashfall and the darkened sky, it felt ominous. I spent the morning working on my truck engine, cleaning ash out of the air system and trying to get it running reliably. While I worked, I kept monitoring the radio. The news was getting worse by the hour. Denver International Airport had shut down indefinitely. Interstate 25 was reported as impassable due to ash accumulation and abandoned vehicles. The power grid in Wyoming had completely collapsed. Emergency services were running out of fuel because supply trucks could not get through the ash-covered roads. I climbed back up the tower that afternoon to check on the communication equipment and get a better view of the surrounding area. From 250 feet up, I could see the highway about 10 miles to the east. It was completely clogged with abandoned vehicles. People had tried to evacuate, but the ashfall and engine problems had stranded thousands of cars and trucks. I could see scattered groups of people on foot, carrying what they could, trudging through the ash-covered landscape. That night, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees. My truck heater was working overtime to keep me from freezing, and I was burning through fuel faster than I had planned. I had enough gas to run the heater for maybe 3 more days if I was conservative. After that, I would be facing the cold with just my sleeping bag and whatever shelter I could improvise. The third day brought the first real snow, not ash, but actual snow mixed with the continuing ashfall. The temperature never got above 20 degrees all day. I was monitoring emergency frequencies and hearing reports of people freezing to death in their cars along the evacuation routes. Rescue services were overwhelmed and running out of resources. Some areas were already being written off as unreachable. I realized I needed to make some hard decisions about my situation. I had enough food for maybe 4 more days if I rationed carefully. My truck was running, but barely, and I was not sure it would make it 20 miles through ash-covered mountain roads to reach the nearest town. Even if I could get to town, what then? From the radio reports, most of the small mountain communities were in chaos with no power, limited food supplies, and overwhelmed by refugees from the ashfall zones. But I had one advantage that most people did not have. I knew the locations of every communication tower within 100 miles, and many of those sites had emergency supply caches. Company policy required backup food, water, fuel, and equipment to be stored at remote tower locations in case technicians got stranded by weather. Most people did not know these caches existed, and they were distributed across the region in defensible locations with backup power systems. More importantly, I was one of the few people left with working communication equipment and the technical knowledge to maintain it. The normal communication infrastructure was failing as power grids collapsed and equipment got damaged by ash. But the tower sites had backup power systems designed to keep working during emergencies. If I could reach them, I could establish a communication network that might help coordinate survival efforts among scattered groups of people. On the 4th morning, I made my decision. I could not stay at this tower site indefinitely. My supplies were running low, and the weather was getting worse every day. I needed to start moving south toward warmer areas and try to reach other tower sites where I could resupply. I had a maintenance route that included 6 tower locations between here and the New Mexico border. If I could reach even half of them, I might be able to establish a communication network and link up with other survivors. I spent that morning preparing for the journey. I loaded everything essential into my truck: food, water, all my climbing and communication equipment, extra clothing, tools, and emergency supplies. I left behind anything that was not absolutely necessary for survival. I also took detailed notes about the tower site's condition and left them in the equipment building in case other technicians came through later. The radio chatter that morning included some interesting reports. There were apparently organized groups of survivors forming in some areas, particularly around natural, warm zones like hot springs. Some military installations were still operational and trying to coordinate rescue efforts, but they were focusing on major population centers and largely ignoring rural areas. There were also disturbing reports of violence and looting as people became more desperate. But the most intriguing reports were coming from an area in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Multiple radio operators were mentioning something called Haven Valley, described as a geothermally heated area where several hundred survivors had gathered. They reportedly had organized leadership, sustainable food production, and were actively trying to make contact with other survivor groups. If it was real, it sounded like exactly the kind of place where my technical skills would be most valuable. I started the truck engine and began the slow, careful drive down the mountain access road. The ash-covered dirt track was treacherous, and I had to stop several times to clear ash from my windshield and check that my engine was not overheating. It took me over an hour to cover the 5 miles to the main road. The paved highway was in terrible condition. Ash had drifted like snow, creating banks several feet deep in some places. Abandoned vehicles were scattered everywhere, some buried up to their windows. I had to drive in the center of the road, weaving around obstacles, rarely able to go faster than 15 miles per hour. Several times I had to get out and shovel ash away from vehicles blocking my path. About 10 miles down the highway, I came across a family stranded beside their minivan. The father was trying to dig ash out of the engine compartment, while his wife and 2 young children waited in the cold. Their vehicle had suffered the same problem as mine, with ash clogging the air intake system. I stopped to help them, sharing some of my technical knowledge about cleaning automotive systems in these conditions. While I worked on their engine, they told me what they had seen during their evacuation attempt. The main highways were completely impassable, clogged with abandoned vehicles and desperate people. Emergency services had stopped responding to calls outside of major cities. Many gas stations had run out of fuel or been looted. They had been trying to reach relatives in Texas but had only made it 50 miles from their home before their van broke down. I managed to get their engine running well enough for them to continue their journey, and I shared some of my emergency food supplies with them. In return, they gave me valuable information about road conditions ahead and warned me about groups of hostile survivors who were attacking other travelers. For supplies, they were heading east toward the interstate, hoping to find a refugee center or military checkpoint. I wished them luck, but privately I doubted they would make it very far in their damaged vehicle with 2 small children. That encounter drove home the reality of what was happening. This was not a temporary disaster that rescue services would handle. This was a complete collapse of the systems that kept civilization functioning. People were on their own, and those without the right skills and resources were not going to survive. I had technical knowledge and equipment that could make the difference between life and death, not just for me, but potentially for many other people. As I continued south, I passed more abandoned vehicles and scattered evidence of the evacuation. Chaos. Some cars had been stripped of anything valuable. Others still contained personal belongings, suggesting their owners had been forced to continue on foot. The ashfall was lighter here, but the temperature remained brutally cold for October. I saw ice forming in puddles and around the edges of streams. My destination for the first day was Tower Site 42 Charlie, about 40 miles south of my starting point. It was located on a ridge overlooking a small valley, with good sight lines for radio communication and a substantial equipment building that should contain emergency supplies. If I could reach it before nightfall, I would have shelter, food, and the ability to set up a proper communication post. The journey took me most of the day, driving slowly through ash-covered roads and around numerous obstacles. I had to stop twice to clean my engine's air intake system, and once to repair a minor radiator leak caused by ash abrasion. Each stop reminded me how precarious my situation was. If my truck broke down completely, I would be on foot in sub-freezing weather with limited supplies, facing a very uncertain future. I reached Tower Site 42 Charlie, just as the sun was setting on my 4th day since the eruption. The access road was barely passable, covered in several inches of ash that had mixed with melting snow to create a slippery, concrete-like surface. My truck was making terrible noises by the time I pulled up to the equipment building, and I knew I was pushing my luck with the engine damage from ash ingestion. The tower site was located on a ridge about 8,000 feet above sea level, which gave me an excellent view of the valley below. What I saw was not encouraging. The small town of Silverton, about 15 miles to the east, showed no signs of electric lights. Smoke was rising from several locations, but whether that was from heating fires or burning buildings, I could not tell from this distance. The entire landscape looked dead and gray under its coating of volcanic ash. The equipment building was secured with a standard company lock, which I had keys for. Inside, I found exactly what I was hoping for: emergency food supplies rated for 2 weeks, several gallons of clean water, a backup generator with fuel, winter clothing, and most importantly, a complete radio communications setup with backup power systems. The company had designed these remote sites to sustain a technician for extended periods during severe weather emergencies. They had not anticipated a volcanic winter, but the preparations were serving me well. I spent my first hour at the site getting the generator running and powering up the communication equipment. The radio systems came online perfectly, and I immediately started scanning frequencies to assess the situation. What I heard was sobering. Most commercial radio stations had gone silent. Emergency services frequencies were sporadic and often desperate. But there were scattered voices, amateur radio operators and survivors trying to coordinate with each other across the chaos. The most significant thing I heard that first night was a weak signal from the south. Someone was broadcasting on a frequency typically used for emergency coordination, and they were mentioning organized survivor groups and supply distribution. The signal was too weak and distorted for me to make out details, but it suggested there might be functioning communities somewhere in the direction I was planning to travel. I also picked up military traffic on encrypted frequencies. I could not decode what they were saying, but the volume of traffic suggested significant military operations were still ongoing. Some government Functions were apparently surviving the disaster, though whether they were focused on rescue operations or just protecting government installations was unclear. That night, temperatures dropped to 8 degrees below zero. My truck would not start in the morning. The ash and extreme cold had finally killed the engine completely. I spent several hours trying to diagnose and repair the problems, but the damage was too extensive for field repairs. The air intake system was completely clogged, the radiator was damaged by ash abrasion, and the electrical system was failing from moisture and debris infiltration. This was my first real crisis moment. I could stay at the tower site indefinitely, using the emergency supplies and communication equipment, but I would eventually run out of food and fuel, or I could abandon the vehicle and continue on foot, carrying only what I could manage in a backpack through increasingly hostile weather. Neither option was appealing, but staying put seemed like slow suicide. I decided to spend the day expanding my communication efforts while I figured out my next move. I climbed the tower to install additional antenna equipment, giving me better range and clearer signals. From the 200-foot level, I could see much further across the landscape, and what I observed was disturbing. There were no signs of vehicle movement on any of the roads within my line of sight. Several structures in the valley below appeared to have collapsed, probably from ash loading on their roofs. The entire region looked abandoned, but the improved antenna setup paid off immediately. I started picking up much clearer signals from other survivors. There was a group holed up in a school building about 30 miles east who were running low on heating fuel. A family trapped in a farmhouse was asking for medical advice because their elderly father was showing signs of hypothermia. Most significantly, I made contact with a survivor who identified himself as being at Tower Site 77 Bravo, which was the next site on my planned route south. The conversation with the other Tower Site survivor was enlightening and terrifying. His name was Jake, and he was a local amateur radio operator who had broken into the tower site when his own home became uninhabitable. He told me that most of the small towns in the area had completely lost power and were being abandoned as heating fuel ran out. People were heading south in large groups, most on foot, carrying whatever they could manage. Many were not surviving the journey. Jake also told me about what he was calling the scavenger problem. Groups of desperate people were systematically looting abandoned homes and businesses, and some of these groups had turned violent. They were particularly targeting anyone who appeared to have vehicles, fuel, or communication equipment. He warned me that traveling alone with obvious technical equipment would make me a target. More encouraging was what Jake told me about the mysterious signals from the south. He had been tracking them for several days and believed they were coming from somewhere in the San Luis Valley area of southern Colorado. The signals included references to something called Haven Valley, which appeared to be a large survivor community with organized leadership and sustainable resources. They were actively trying to establish communication with other survivor groups and coordinate supply sharing. This gave me a concrete destination and a sense of purpose beyond just personal survival. If I could reach this Haven Valley community, my technical skills could be valuable in helping them expand their communication network and coordinate with other survivor groups. It was about 80 miles from my current location, but there were 3 more tower sites along the route where I could resupply and establish communication relay points. The problem was getting there. On foot, carrying everything I needed for survival, 80 miles through ash-covered mountain terrain in sub-zero weather, was probably impossible. I needed to find alternative transportation or a way to repair my truck. While I was considering my options, I received an unexpected radio call. The voice identified herself as Maria Santos, and she was transmitting from a location about 20 miles south of my position. She said she was a former emergency medical technician who had been trying to help injured survivors, but her own vehicle had broken down and she was stranded. She had heard my transmissions and was asking if I could provide assistance. She also mentioned that she had information about working vehicles and supply caches in the area. This presented both an opportunity and a dilemma. Helping Maria would mean leaving my secure position at the tower site and venturing out into dangerous territory. But she might have access to transportation that could get us both further south, and her medical skills could be valuable. I also realized that traveling with a partner would be much safer than continuing alone. I arranged to meet Maria at an abandoned gas station that was roughly halfway between our positions. I loaded my most essential equipment into a large backpack, including portable radio, gear, climbing equipment, tools, and emergency supplies. I left the tower site's communication equipment running on automatic relay mode, so it would continue to serve as a communication hub for other survivors, even if I was not there to operate. The 12-mile hike to the meeting point took me most of the day. The ash-covered terrain was treacherous, and I had to rest frequently to avoid exhaustion in the thin mountain air. I passed through 2 abandoned communities along the way. Both showed signs of hasty evacuation, with doors left open and personal belongings scattered in the streets. Some houses had collapsed from ash loading, while others showed evidence of having been searched by scavengers. At one point, I had to take cover behind an overturned truck when I heard voices approaching. A group of 6 or 7 people passed by on the road, all carrying heavy packs and what looked like improvised weapons. They were discussing which houses to search next and how to deal with anyone they might find hiding inside. I waited until they were well past before continuing my journey. I reached the gas station meeting point just before sunset. The building had been thoroughly looted, with broken glass and scattered merchandise everywhere. But Maria was there, and she was exactly what she had claimed to be. She was in her early 30s, obviously experienced in medical procedures, and carrying a well-organized pack of medical supplies. More importantly, she had information about a working vehicle. Maria told me she had been treating injured survivors for over a week, moving from house to house in the area. She had discovered a pickup truck in a barn about 5 miles away that the owner had been preparing for winter storage when the disaster struck. The truck was in good mechanical condition and had been protected from ash damage. The owner had died from exposure while trying to walk to town for help, but Maria had found the keys and determined that the vehicle was still functional. The catch was that the truck had less than a quarter tank of fuel, and Maria had not been able to find any additional gasoline in the area. Most gas stations had been looted or had lost power for their pumps. We would need to be very strategic about fuel usage if we were going to make it to Haven Valley, or even to the next tower site with supply caches. Maria also shared disturbing information about what was happening to survivor groups in the area. Several communities that had tried to establish themselves in schools or other large buildings had been overrun by desperate people demanding to be let in. The lack of heating fuel and medical supplies was causing deaths from exposure and treatable injuries. She estimated that more than half the people who had initially survived the ash fall were now dead from secondary causes. But she also had encouraging news about medical supplies. During her travels treating patients, she had identified several abandoned medical facilities that had not been completely looted. With proper equipment and transportation, we could potentially salvage significant quantities of antibiotics, medical equipment, and first aid supplies. These would be incredibly valuable for trading with other survivor groups or for supporting a larger community like Haven Valley. We spent the night in the gas station, taking turns keeping watch. The temperature dropped to 12 below zero, and we had to share body heat and combine our sleeping bags to avoid hypothermia. During my watch periods, I monitored radio traffic and continued to track the signals from Haven Valley. The transmissions were becoming clearer as we moved south, and I was able to pick up more details about their organization. Haven Valley appeared to have several hundred survivors, organized leadership, sustainable food production using geothermal greenhouses, and active programs for integrating new arrivals. They were actively seeking people with technical skills, medical training, and other specialized knowledge. Most importantly for our situation, they were coordinating supply runs to outlying areas and had vehicles capable of traveling through the harsh conditions. In the morning, we set out for the barn where Maria had found the truck. The 5-mile hike took us through some of the most devastated terrain I had seen since the eruption. The ash accumulation was deeper here, in some places reaching above our knees. Several houses had completely collapsed, and we found evidence of families who had died from exposure while trying to shelter in inadequate buildings. The truck was exactly as Maria had described it, a heavy-duty pickup that had been well maintained and protected from the ash. It started on the second try, though the engine ran rough in the extreme cold. We loaded our combined supplies into the truck bed and began planning our route south. We had enough fuel to travel maybe 60 miles if we were careful, which would get us to the next tower site with hopefully some margin for detours around obstacles. As we prepared to leave, Maria revealed something that changed our entire situation. While treating patients in the area, she had encountered a family who claimed to be in radio contact with Haven Valley. They had been given specific instructions for reaching the community, including recognition codes and rally points. More importantly, they had been told that Haven Valley was planning to send out rescue teams to collect survivors from predetermined locations, but only if those survivors could provide valuable skills or resources to the community. This meant that instead of just hoping to find Haven Valley, we could potentially arrange to be picked up by one of their teams. My communication and technical repair skills, combined with Maria's medical training, would make us attractive candidates for rescue. We just needed to reach a location where we could establish reliable radio communication with their coordinators. The nearest such location was Tower Site 77 Bravo, where Jake was stationed. If we could reach him, we could use his communication setup to contact Haven Valley directly and arrange for pickup. It was about 40 miles away, well within our fuel range, and Jake had indicated he had additional supplies and fuel stored at his location. We started driving south, following back roads to avoid the main highways where abandoned vehicles and desperate survivor groups posed the greatest risks. The truck handled the ash-covered roads better than my previous vehicle, but we still had to drive slowly and stop frequently to clear the windshield and check for engine problems. About 20 miles into our journey, we encountered our first real test of the new partnership. We came across a family stranded beside their broken-down car, a couple with 3 young children who were clearly suffering from exposure. They begged us for help, and Maria immediately wanted to stop and treat them. I was torn between the humanitarian impulse and the practical reality that we barely had enough resources for ourselves. We ended up spending several hours with the family. Maria treated the children for early-stage hypothermia and frostbite while I attempted to repair their vehicle. I managed to get their engine running temporarily, but it was clear the car would not last much longer. We shared some of our food supplies and gave them directions to an abandoned school building where they might find better shelter. The encounter left us both emotionally drained and reminded us of the impossible choices we were facing. There were thousands of people in similar situations throughout the region, and we could not help them all. Our best contribution would be to reach Haven Valley and help them expand their rescue and relief capabilities. But leaving that family behind, knowing they probably would not survive much longer, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. As we continued south, the radio traffic I was monitoring revealed that our situation was not unique. Survivor groups throughout the region were facing similar moral dilemmas as resources became scarce and weather conditions worsened. Some communities were maintaining their humanitarian values and trying to help everyone they encountered. Others were becoming increasingly selective about who they would assist, focusing only on people who could contribute useful skills or resources. There were also disturbing reports of violence and conflict between survivor groups. Competition for limited supplies was leading to raids and territorial disputes. Some groups were attempting to claim and defend resource caches or advantageous locations. The breakdown of law enforcement and government authority was allowing the worst aspects of human nature to emerge in some areas. But there were also inspiring stories of cooperation and mutual aid. Communities were sharing resources across long distances, coordinating rescue efforts, and working together to maintain communication networks. The amateur radio community in particular was providing vital coordination for relief efforts, connecting isolated survivors with resources and assistance. We reached Tower Site 77 Bravo just before nightfall on my 8th day since the eruption. Jake was there as promised, and he welcomed us warmly. He had been alone for several days and was grateful for the company and additional skills we brought. His communications setup was even more sophisticated than mine, with multiple radio systems and antenna arrays that gave him contact with survivor groups across several states. Jake confirmed what we had been hearing about Haven Valley. It was real, it was substantial, and they were actively recruiting people with valuable skills. He had been in direct communication with their coordinators and had already arranged for his own eventual evacuation to their location. With our additional skills and resources, He was confident we could all be included in the next pickup operation. The plan was for us to remain at the tower site for several more days, using the communication equipment to coordinate with Haven Valley and other survivor groups in the region. Jake had enough supplies to support all three of us for at least a week, and the tower site's defenses and communication capabilities made it one of the safest locations in the area. But as we settled in for our first night together, Jake shared some troubling intelligence he had gathered from his radio monitoring. There were organized groups of raiders operating in the region, specifically targeting communication sites and anyone with valuable equipment. They had already attacked 2 tower sites to the east, killing the operators and stealing all the equipment. We were likely to be targeted next if we stayed in one location too long. This news forced us to reconsider our timeline. We needed to establish contact with Haven Valley quickly and arrange for extraction before the raiders located our position. The next few days would be critical in determining whether we could successfully reach safety or whether we would become the next victims of the escalating violence that was consuming the region. The morning of my 9th day since the Yellowstone eruption brought news that changed everything. Jake had been monitoring emergency frequencies all night, and what he heard made all three of us realize we could not wait any longer for Haven Valley's rescue team. The family I had helped repair their vehicle several days earlier was broadcasting a desperate distress call. They had made it only 20 miles before their car died completely, and now they were trapped in an abandoned farmhouse, with their youngest child showing signs of severe hypothermia. Maria immediately wanted to attempt a rescue mission. As a former EMT, she could not ignore a medical emergency involving children. I understood her position, but I also knew the risks. The family was 50 miles away through increasingly hostile territory, and we had limited fuel and medical supplies. Jake argued that we should focus on our own survival and getting to Haven Valley, where we could do more good for more people. The debate went on for hours, but Maria's medical training gave her arguments weight that neither Jake nor I could ignore. She explained that the child's condition, based on the symptoms described over the radio, was treatable if we could reach them within the next day or two. Without intervention, the child would die, and possibly the other family members as well, from exposure and despair. I found myself torn between practical survival considerations and moral obligations. My technical skills were needed at Haven Valley to help build their communication network, but those skills would be meaningless if I lost my humanity in the process of survival. Finally, I made the decision that would define the next phase of our journey. We would attempt the rescue mission, but we would do it strategically, using it as an opportunity to move closer to Haven Valley while helping the family. Jake decided to remain at the tower site to maintain our communication hub and continue coordinating with Haven Valley. This made sense because someone needed to keep the radio equipment operational, and Jake's local knowledge was most valuable at this location. Maria and I would take the truck and attempt to reach the family, then continue south toward Haven Valley rather than returning to the tower site. We loaded the truck with medical supplies, emergency equipment, and everything we would need for an extended journey. Maria packed antibiotics, IV fluids, and other critical medical supplies that could save the child's life. I brought my portable communication equipment, climbing gear, and tools that might be useful for vehicle repairs or other technical problems. The 50-mile journey to reach the family took us most of the day and used more than half our remaining fuel. The roads were in terrible condition, with ash drifts that sometimes blocked our path completely. We had to make several detours around abandoned vehicle clusters and areas where bridges had been damaged by the weight of ash accumulation. Along the way, we passed through 3 small communities that had been completely abandoned. The silence was eerie. These had been functioning towns just 2 weeks earlier, with schools and businesses and families living normal lives. Now they were ghost towns, with collapsed roofs and scattered belongings telling the story of hasty evacuations that had come too late for many residents. We also encountered other survivors, and not all of these encounters were friendly. At one point, we had to detour around a roadblock where armed men were stopping vehicles and demanding tolls for passage. Maria wanted to negotiate with them, arguing that we were on a medical mission, but I convinced her that the risk was too great. These were not people interested in humanitarian concerns. The family was exactly where they said they would be, sheltering in an abandoned farmhouse about 2 miles off the main road. The building was in poor condition, with broken windows and a roof that was sagging under the weight of accumulated ash. They had been trying to heat the interior using furniture and debris burned in a metal trash can, but the smoke was making the air quality dangerous. Maria immediately went to work on the sick child, a 6-year-old girl who was showing classic signs of severe hypothermia and dehydration. The child's core body temperature was dangerously low, and she was barely conscious. Maria started IV fluids and began the careful rewarming process that could save the child's life or kill her, if done incorrectly. While Maria worked on the medical emergency, I assessed the family's overall situation and tried to develop a plan for getting them to safety. The parents were both suffering from exposure and malnutrition, and their other 2 children were showing early signs of hypothermia. They had been surviving on minimal food for over a week, and their physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The father told me what they had experienced during their failed evacuation attempt. They had initially tried to reach relatives in Kansas, but the interstate highways were completely impassable. After their car broke down, they had tried to continue on foot, but the youngest child had collapsed after just a few miles. They had taken shelter in the farmhouse and been trapped there as weather conditions worsened. He also shared valuable intelligence about the area we were traveling through. There were several groups of raiders operating along the main route south, preying on other survivors. Some of these groups had military equipment and weapons, suggesting they might be deserters from evacuation operations or National Guard units that had broken down. The family had seen convoys of military vehicles heading south several days earlier, but none had stopped to offer assistance to civilians. More encouraging was his report of organized rescue operations in some areas. He had heard radio broadcasts from government agencies that were still functioning, coordinating supply drops and evacuations from major population centers. There were also reports of large survivor communities establishing themselves around natural resources like geothermal areas or locations with sustainable food production. Maria's treatment of the sick child was successful. After several hours of careful rewarming and fluid replacement, the girl's condition stabilized and she regained consciousness. It was a small victory in an increasingly dark situation, but it reinforced our decision to attempt the rescue mission. We had saved a life, and that had to count for something in the moral calculus of survival. But our success created a new problem. The family was in no condition to travel on foot, and our truck could not carry 7 people plus all our essential supplies. We needed to find additional transportation or figure out an alternative plan for getting everyone to safety. The father mentioned seeing several abandoned vehicles in the area, and I decided to spend time the next morning checking whether any of them could be repaired. That night, we took turns keeping watch while the family slept in the warmest part of the farmhouse. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero, and we had to share all our sleeping bags and emergency heating supplies to keep everyone from freezing. It was a long, uncomfortable night that reminded all of us how precarious our situation remained. During my watch periods, I monitored radio traffic and tried to maintain contact with Jake at the tower site. The news was not encouraging. Jake reported that raider activity was increasing throughout the region, and several survivor groups had been attacked in the past 24 hours. More troubling was his report that military radio traffic had decreased significantly, suggesting that government rescue operations were being scaled back or redirected. However, Jake also had positive news about Haven Valley. He had established direct contact with their coordinators and confirmed that they were actively seeking people with our skills. They were willing to accept the family we had rescued, especially since Maria's medical skills were desperately needed at their location. The challenge was arranging transportation and safe passage through increasingly dangerous territory. In the morning, I spent several hours checking abandoned vehicles in the area. Most had been damaged by ash ingestion or had been stripped of useful parts by other survivors. But I found a pickup truck in a garage that had been protected from ash damage and appeared to be in working condition. The owner had apparently died in the house, but the truck keys were still in his pocket. Getting the truck running required some improvisation and technical knowledge, but I managed to clear the fuel system and get the engine started. It was not in perfect condition, but it would run well enough to carry the family and some of our supplies. Combined with our original truck, we now had enough transportation capacity to move everyone toward Haven Valley. The family was pathetically grateful for our help, and they had information that proved valuable for our continued journey. The father had been a volunteer firefighter before the disaster, and he knew the locations of emergency supply caches and equipment stored at fire stations throughout the region. Many of these locations had not been looted because most people did not know they existed. Maria suggested that we make strategic stops at these locations to resupply before continuing toward Haven Valley. Medical supplies, emergency food, and fuel were all stored at fire stations, and we needed all of these resources for the extended journey ahead. The family also knew back roads and alternate routes that would help us avoid the main highways where raiders were most active. Our convoy of 2 trucks left the farmhouse on the morning of my 11th day since the eruption. We were now traveling as a group of 7 people, which provided some security advantages but also made us more visible and slower moving. The children were still weak from their ordeal, requiring frequent stops for rest and medical attention. Our first destination was a volunteer fire station about 20 miles south, located in a small community that had been completely evacuated. The father's information proved accurate. The fire station was locked but not heavily secured, and inside, we found emergency medical supplies, non-perishable food, and most importantly, a reserve fuel tank that was still half full. While we were loading supplies from the fire station, we encountered another group of survivors. A convoy of 3 vehicles approached from the east, and initially we were not sure whether they were friendly or hostile. But they turned out to be a group of families who were also heading south, looking for safer areas and organized communities. The leader of this group was a former National Guard sergeant named Rodriguez, who had been separated from his unit during the initial evacuation chaos. He had been traveling with 15 other survivors, including several families with children. They had heard radio reports about Haven Valley and were trying to reach it, but they lacked detailed navigation information and communication equipment. Rodriguez's group had valuable resources that complemented our capabilities. They had military experience, weapons for defense, and additional vehicles. But they also had more people to feed and protect, which would stretch our combined resources. After much discussion, we decided to travel together, at least temporarily, because the safety advantages of a larger group outweighed the resource challenges. Our combined convoy now included 5 vehicles and 22 people. This was large, enough to discourage casual attacks by raiders, but also large enough to attract serious attention from organized hostile groups. Rodriguez warned us that his group had already been attacked twice during their journey, and they had been forced to abandon some of their original members who were slowing down the group. The sergeant also shared disturbing intelligence about military operations in the region. According to radio intercepts he had been monitoring, regular military units were withdrawing from civilian rescue operations and focusing on protecting government facilities and strategic resources. Some National Guard units had reportedly gone rogue, either deserting completely or setting themselves up as warlords controlling territory and resources. But Rodriguez also confirmed what we had been hearing about Haven Valley. His group had made radio contact with them several days earlier, and they had been given specific rally points and recognition codes for approaching the community safely. Haven Valley was apparently surrounded by defensive positions and had protocols for vetting new arrivals to prevent infiltration by hostile groups. As our enlarged convoy continued south, we began encountering more evidence of the breakdown in social order that was occurring throughout the region. We passed several locations where battles had apparently taken place between different survivor groups. Burned vehicles, improvised fortifications, and scattered equipment told stories of desperate conflicts over resources and territory. We also found evidence of successful cooperation between survivor groups. At one abandoned truck stop, we discovered a message board where different groups had been leaving, information about safe routes, resource locations, and warnings about hostile areas. The amateur radio community was playing a crucial role in coordinating these information-sharing efforts. One message on the board was particularly relevant to our situation. A group identifying themselves as the Colorado Amateur Radio Emergency Network had established a series of communication relay stations between Denver and the New Mexico border. They were providing coordination services for survivor groups and maintaining contact with government agencies that were still operational. I was able to make contact with this network using my portable radio equipment, and they provided updated information about conditions along our planned route to Haven Valley. The news was mixed. Several bridges had been destroyed by groups trying to control travel routes, but there were alternate paths that were still passable. More concerning were reports of a large raider group that was moving through our general area, attacking survivor convoys and seizing their vehicles and supplies. The network coordinator also had encouraging news about Haven Valley. They had been in regular contact with the community's leadership, and Haven Valley was actively expanding their operations. They had sent out multiple teams to establish supply, caches, and communication relay points throughout southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. If we could reach one of these relay points, we could get current information about safe approaches to the main community.
As we approached our 13th day since the eruption, our convoy was making good progress toward Haven Valley, but we were also entering increasingly dangerous territory. The raider activity was intensifying, and we were carrying supplies and
equipment that would make us attractive targets. Rodriguez and I spent considerable time planning defensive strategies and escape routes in case we were attacked. Maria had been treating various medical problems among our group members, and she was becoming increasingly concerned about our long-term health prospects. The combination of extreme cold, poor nutrition, and constant stress was taking a toll on everyone, especially the children. Several people were showing signs of malnutrition and exposure-related illnesses that would become serious if not addressed soon. The psychological pressure was also becoming a significant factor. The constant threat of attack, the harsh living conditions, and the uncertainty about our ultimate destination were affecting group morale. Some members were beginning to question whether Haven Valley actually existed or whether we were chasing a fantasy that would lead us all to destruction. But we also had reasons for optimism. Our communication equipment was picking up increasingly clear signals from Haven Valley, and the content of their broadcasts suggested a well-organized community with substantial resources. They were coordinating supply distributions, medical services, and even educational programs for children. If it was real, it represented exactly the kind of sustainable community that could provide long-term survival. On the morning of day 14, everything changed when we received an urgent radio message from Jake back at the tower site. Raiders had attacked his position during the night, and he had been forced to evacuate with only emergency supplies. The tower site communication equipment had been destroyed, and Jake was now on foot trying to reach our position. He estimated that the raider group included at least 20 people with military weapons and vehicles. This news meant that our primary communication hub was gone, and Jake was now a refugee like the rest of us. But it also meant that the raiders had obtained detailed information about our convoy and our planned route to Haven Valley. Jake had not been captured, but they had access to all the communication logs and route planning information that had been stored at the tower site. Rodriguez immediately began planning defensive measures and considering whether we should change our route or try to reach Haven Valley as quickly as possible. The debate was intense because both options carried significant risks. Changing our route would take us through unfamiliar territory without the communication support we had been counting on. But continuing on our planned route would take us directly into an area where hostile forces now had advanced knowledge of our movements. The decision was made for us when our scouts reported a large group of vehicles approaching from the north, moving fast and apparently tracking our route. We had perhaps an hour before they would reach our position, and we needed to decide immediately whether to make a stand, attempt to flee, or try to negotiate. With 22 people, including children, our options were limited, and the next few hours would determine whether our rescue mission would end in success or tragedy. The sight of dust clouds on the northern horizon meant we had less than an hour before the raider convoy reached our position. Rodriguez immediately took charge of our defensive preparations, while I worked frantically to establish emergency communication with any groups that might be able to provide assistance. 22 people, including 6 children, were depending on decisions we made in the next few minutes, and none of our options looked good. Our location was tactically poor for defense. We were in a valley with limited visibility and escape routes, surrounded by hills that would give attackers commanding positions. Rodriguez counted at least 8 vehicles in the approaching convoy, which meant we were probably outnumbered 2-to-1 by people who had military weapons and combat experience. Our group included families with children who could not move quickly or fight effectively. I managed to reach the Colorado Amateur Radio Emergency Network and broadcast an emergency distress call with our exact coordinates. The network coordinator promised to relay our situation to any government or military units in the area, but warned that official rescue resources were extremely limited. Most military units had withdrawn from the region, and the few remaining government operations were focused on protecting major population centers. More promising was contact I established with a Haven Valley patrol team that was operating about 40 miles south of our position. They had been monitoring our convoy's progress and were already moving north to provide escort for the final approach to their community. But they were still hours away, and we needed immediate assistance to survive the next encounter. Rodriguez made the tactical decision to abandon our current position and attempt a fighting withdrawal toward higher ground, where we might have better defensive advantages. This meant leaving behind most of our supplies and non-essential equipment, but keeping our vehicles and enough resources to continue the journey if we survived the next few hours. The convoy movement was chaotic and terrifying. We had 5 vehicles carrying 22 people, trying to maintain formation while moving as quickly as possible over rough terrain. The children were crying, adults were shouting navigation instructions, and everyone was scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. I was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to coordinate our movement while maintaining contact with potential rescue forces. About 10 minutes into our withdrawal, the raiders appeared on the ridgeline behind us. I counted 9 vehicles, including what looked like military trucks with mounted weapons. They were moving faster than our convoy and would overtake us within 15 or 20 minutes unless we found a way to slow them down or reach defensible terrain. Rodriguez ordered 2 of our vehicles to take positions where they could provide covering fire while the rest of the convoy continued toward a rocky outcropping that might offer some protection. This meant splitting our forces and leaving some of our people in extremely dangerous positions, but it was our only chance to prevent the entire group from being overrun. I found myself in one of the covering vehicles with Rodriguez and 2 other men who had military experience. We positioned ourselves behind an abandoned truck where we could observe the raider approach and hopefully delay their advance long enough for the families to reach safety. It was the most terrifying situation I had ever been in, watching armed enemies approach while knowing that people I cared about were depending on our actions. The raiders opened fire while they were still at long range, apparently trying to disable our vehicles rather than kill us immediately. This suggested they wanted to capture us alive, probably to interrogate us about other survivor groups and resource locations. Rodriguez returned fire selectively, trying to conserve ammunition while discouraging them from advancing too quickly. During the firefight, I maintained radio contact with our other vehicles and continued broadcasting emergency calls for assistance. The Haven Valley Patrol team reported they were moving toward our position as quickly as possible, but estimated they were still at least 90 minutes away. The amateur radio network was trying to contact military units, but no immediate help was available. The engagement lasted about 20 minutes before the raiders attempted to flank our position. Rodriguez realized we could not hold our ground much longer and ordered a withdrawal to the rocky outcropping where the rest of our group had taken shelter. We abandoned the covering position under fire, with bullets hitting the ground around us as we ran for our vehicles. The outcropping provided better protection, but we were still outnumbered and outgunned. The raiders took positions surrounding our location and began what appeared to be a siege. They had time on their side because we had limited food, water, and ammunition, while they could wait for reinforcements or simply let exposure and dehydration force us to surrender. During the lull in fighting, I was able to establish more detailed communication with the Haven Valley Patrol team. They had been joined by additional vehicles and now had enough firepower to engage the raiders effectively, but they needed precise information about positions and numbers to avoid hitting our people in the crossfire. I used my climbing equipment to reach a high point where I could observe the entire tactical situation and provide coordination. From the elevated position, I could see that the raiders had made a critical mistake. They had positioned themselves in a valley where they would be vulnerable to attack from the surrounding ridgelines. If the Haven Valley team could reach those ridgelines without being detected, they could catch the raiders in a crossfire that would force them to withdraw or be destroyed. I coordinated this tactical information through the radio network, providing detailed descriptions of raider positions and suggesting approach routes for the rescue force. It was the first time my technical communication skills had been used for military coordination, and the responsibility was overwhelming. People were going to live or die based on the accuracy of the information I provided. The Haven Valley Patrol team reached the area about 2 hours after the siege began. I guided them to positions on the surrounding ridgelines using radio communication and visual signals. The coordination was complex because we needed to avoid friendly fire while ensuring the raiders could not escape to threaten other survivor groups in the region. When the rescue team opened fire, the tactical situation changed completely within minutes. The raiders found themselves surrounded and taking casualties from multiple directions. Several of their vehicles were disabled immediately, and their leadership apparently decided that our convoy was not worth the losses they were taking. They withdrew rapidly, leaving behind damaged equipment and abandoning their siege. The rescue was successful, but several people in our group had been wounded during the fighting. Maria immediately began treating gunshot wounds and injuries from flying debris. 2 of the raiders had also been wounded and left behind during their withdrawal, and Maria insisted on treating them as well despite strong objections from some of our group members. The Haven Valley Patrol team was led by a woman named Captain Sarah Chen, who had been a military logistics officer before the disaster. She confirmed that Haven Valley was real, substantial, and actively working to establish a network of allied communities throughout the region. Our convoy would be welcome there, and our skills would be valuable for their expansion plans. Captain Chen also provided crucial intelligence about the regional situation. The raider group that had attacked us was one of several operating throughout southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. They were becoming increasingly organized and aggressive, targeting survivor convoys and established communities. Haven Valley had been fighting a low-level war against these groups for several weeks. More concerning was her report that some of these raider groups had connections to military deserters and were obtaining advanced weapons and equipment. There were reports of raider attacks using military vehicles and coordinated tactics that suggested professional leadership. The breakdown of government authority was allowing the worst elements of society to organize and prey on legitimate survivor communities. But Captain Chen also had encouraging news about the broader survival situation. Haven Valley was in contact with dozens of other communities across multiple states, and many were thriving despite the harsh conditions. Some areas with geothermal activity were maintaining near-normal living conditions, and agricultural communities with greenhouse facilities were producing food successfully. The journey to Haven Valley took another full day, traveling in convoy, with the patrol team providing security. We passed through several abandoned communities and around areas that showed evidence of recent fighting. The landscape was devastated, but there were also signs of recovery and rebuilding in some locations. About 20 miles from Haven Valley, we began encountering outer defensive positions and communication checkpoints. The community had established a security perimeter with overlapping fields of observation and fire designed to prevent surprise attacks while allowing legitimate visitors to approach safely. The level of organization was impressive and suggested that Haven Valley had substantial resources and experienced leadership. The approach to the main community required following a specific route through defensive positions while maintaining radio contact with security coordinators. Any deviation from the prescribed path would result in being challenged by armed guards who had orders to shoot first and ask questions later. The security measures were necessary given the raider threat, but they also demonstrated that Haven Valley was serious about protecting their people and resources. My first view of Haven Valley itself was breathtaking after 2 weeks of traveling through devastated territory. The community was built around a series of natural hot springs that provided heating for residential and agricultural buildings. Steam rose from dozens of locations, creating a microclimate that was noticeably warmer than the surrounding areas. The community included about 300 people living in a variety of structures ranging from permanent buildings to temporary shelters. There were extensive greenhouse facilities for food production, workshops for manufacturing and repair, and a communication center that rivaled anything I had seen at commercial facilities. Solar panels and small wind turbines provided electrical power, supplemented by geothermal generators. But what impressed me most was the level of organization and planning evident throughout the community. There were clear leadership structures, work assignments based on skills and abilities, and systems for integrating new arrivals. Children were attending classes in heated buildings, and there were medical facilities staffed by trained professionals like Maria. The community leadership interviewed each member of our convoy individually to assess skills, health status, and potential security risks. My technical background in telecommunications made me immediately valuable for their communication expansion plans. They needed someone who could establish relay stations and maintain contact with other survivor communities across a wider area. Maria's medical training was even more urgently needed. The community had doctors and nurses, but they were overwhelmed by the number of patients requiring treatment for exposure, malnutrition, and trauma injuries. The medical facilities were well equipped, but they needed additional trained personnel to operate effectively. The family we had rescued was assigned housing and support services, and their children were enrolled in the community school program. Seeing them safe and beginning to recover from their ordeal validated our decision to attempt the rescue mission. Sometimes doing the right thing did work out, even in the midst of a civilizational collapse. Rodriguez and the other members of his group were also welcomed and given assignments based on their military experience. Haven Valley needed people with tactical skills to help defend against raider attacks and coordinate security for supply runs to other communities. The community was not just focused on survival, but on actively working to rebuild some semblance of organized society. During my first week at Haven Valley, I worked with their communication team to establish contact with survivor groups throughout a much wider area. Using my knowledge of tower locations and radio propagation, we were able to extend their communication network to cover most of Colorado and parts of surrounding states. This allowed for coordination of resource sharing, mutual defense agreements, and rescue operations. The work was deeply satisfying because it represented exactly the kind of contribution I had hoped to make when I first decided to leave my tower site and attempt to reach other survivors. My specialized technical knowledge was making a real difference in helping people survive and communities thrive. It gave purpose and meaning to the hardships we had endured during the journey. But the work also revealed the scope of the challenges facing survivor communities throughout the region. Many groups were failing due to lack of resources, leadership, or technical knowledge. Others were being destroyed by raider attacks or internal conflicts. The successful communities like Haven Valley were the exception rather than the rule, and their success required constant vigilance and hard work. The regional picture emerging from our expanded communication network was sobering. Government authority had essentially collapsed across most of the western states. Military units were either withdrawn to protect strategic facilities or had broken down into smaller groups focused on local survival. Some areas were controlled by warlords or raider gangs, while others had devolved into chaos with no organized authority at all. Yet there were also reasons for hope. Communities like Haven Valley were proving that organized survival was possible with proper planning and leadership. Agricultural production was continuing in some areas, and manufacturing capabilities were being rebuilt on a smaller scale. The amateur radio networks were providing coordination that helped isolated communities connect and support each other. Most significantly, there were reports of similar communities establishing themselves in other regions with favorable geographic conditions. Geothermal areas, regions with sustainable water sources, and locations with existing infrastructure were becoming centers for rebuilding efforts. The network of cooperating communities was slowly expanding, creating the foundation for eventual, larger-scale recovery. As my third week at Haven Valley began, I was asked to take on additional responsibilities coordinating with these other communities and planning for expanded rescue operations. The leadership wanted to send out more teams like the one that had rescued us, but this required detailed intelligence about routes, threats, and potential survivors. My communication network would be crucial for gathering and analyzing this information. The assignment was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. The decisions we made about rescue priorities and resource allocation would determine who lived and who died among the scattered survivor groups throughout the region. It was the kind of moral weight I had never expected to carry when I climbed that tower on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning just 3 weeks earlier. But it was also an opportunity to help rebuild something better than what had been destroyed. The old world had been unprepared for the disaster that struck it. The new communities rising from the ashes had the chance to build more resilient systems and more cooperative social structures. Whether they would succeed depended partly on people like me using whatever skills we had to support the effort. The morning of my 21st day since the eruption, I received a radio message that would change our situation once again. Galangar. Range communications were picking up signals from the eastern part of the country that were unlike anything we had heard before. The transmissions were highly organized, using sophisticated encryption, and appeared to be coordinating large-scale operations across multiple states. Whether these represented government recovery efforts, military operations, or something else entirely was unclear, but they suggested that major organized forces were still active somewhere in the region. The encrypted signals from the east were growing stronger every day, and by my 22nd day since the Yellowstone eruption, I was spending most of my time trying to decode their meaning. The transmissions were highly sophisticated, using military-grade encryption and coordination protocols that suggested a large, well-organized force was operating somewhere beyond our communication range. Haven Valley's leadership was increasingly concerned about what these signals might represent. Captain Chen assigned me to work with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a former NSA cryptographer who had arrived at Haven Valley the week before our convoy. Together we analyzed the signal patterns and tried to determine whether we were dealing with legitimate government forces, rogue military units, or something else entirely. The implications for our community's security were enormous. What we discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The signal analysis suggested that organized military operations were continuing across multiple eastern states, with coordination centers that had survived the volcanic winter. Supply convoys were moving between established bases, and there appeared to be ongoing efforts to re-establish communication with isolated communities. This indicated that some government functions had survived the disaster. But there were also disturbing elements in the transmissions. References to population consolidation, resource requisition, and mandatory relocation suggested that these operations might not be focused on humanitarian relief. Some of the coded language was consistent with martial law enforcement and military occupation of civilian areas. Whether these forces would view communities like Haven Valley as allies or threats was unclear. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring these signals since arriving at Haven Valley, and she believed they originated from a command center somewhere in the Colorado Springs area. NORAD and other military installations in that region had deep underground facilities designed to survive nuclear war, and they would certainly be capable of weathering a volcanic winter. If these facilities were still operational, they might be coordinating recovery efforts across a much wider area than we had imagined. The strategic implications were significant for Haven Valley's future development. If legitimate government forces were re-establishing control in the region, our community would need to prepare for eventual contact and possible integration into larger recovery operations. But if these were rogue military units or authoritarian forces, we might need to defend ourselves against a much more serious threat than raider gangs. I was tasked with attempting direct communication with the Eastern forces while maintaining operational security for our community. This required setting up additional communication equipment on the mountain peaks surrounding Haven Valley, giving us both better signal range and multiple fallback positions if our primary facilities were compromised. The work took several days and required all of my climbing and technical skills. From the summit of Mount Esperanza, the highest peak in our area, I finally achieved clear communication with the Eastern Command Center. The response was immediate and professional. confirming that we were dealing with U.S. military forces operating under continuity of government protocols. Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer, was coordinating recovery operations across Colorado and several neighboring states. The conversation was carefully structured, with both sides revealing limited information while trying to assess the other's capabilities and intentions. Colonel Harrison confirmed that federal government operations were continuing from hardened facilities and that recovery efforts were focused on reestablishing communication with survivor communities and coordinating resource distribution. He was very interested in Haven Valley's location, population, and capabilities, but there were aspects of the conversation that concerned me. Colonel Harrison's questions focused heavily on our defensive capabilities, resource stockpiles, and relationships with other communities in the region. When I asked about civilian evacuation and humanitarian relief operations, his responses were vague and bureaucratic. The military's priorities seemed to be intelligence gathering and strategic assessment rather than immediate assistance to survivors. Most troubling was his insistence that all survivor communities needed to register with military authorities and accept oversight of their operations. He described this as necessary for coordinating relief efforts and preventing conflicts between groups, but it sounded very much like a demand for political control. Communities that refused to cooperate would be classified as potential security threats. I reported this conversation to Haven Valley's Leadership Council, and the response was immediate debate about how to proceed. Some members argued that cooperation with military authorities was our best chance for long-term survival and eventual return to normal civilization. Others worried that registration would lead to loss of autonomy and possible dissolution of our community. Captain Chen, with her military background, provided crucial perspective on the situation. She believed that Colonel Harrison's unit was legitimate military operating under emergency authority, but she was concerned about their apparent shift from rescue operations to control and consolidation. The military's focus seemed to be on managing survivor populations rather than supporting independent communities. The debate was interrupted by urgent radio traffic from our patrol teams. A large convoy of military vehicles was approaching Haven Valley from the east, moving in formation and apparently heading directly for our location. Colonel Harrison had not mentioned any immediate deployment to our area, which suggested either poor communication within his command structure or deliberate deception about their intentions. The convoy included 12 vehicles with approximately 60 personnel, along with heavy equipment and what appeared to be communication and surveillance gear. This was not a humanitarian relief mission or a courtesy visit. It was a substantial military operation designed to establish control over our community and assess our strategic value. Haven Valley's leadership had perhaps 2 hours to decide how to respond to this approaching force. We could prepare defensive positions and resist military occupation, potentially leading to a battle that would destroy our community. We could cooperate fully and hope that military control would ultimately benefit our people. Or we could attempt some form of negotiated arrangement that preserved our autonomy while satisfying military requirements. I volunteered to serve as the primary liaison with the military force, using my technical background and recent communication with Colonel Harrison to establish credibility. Maria would provide medical support and help assess the military personnel for signs of hostile intentions. Captain Chen would coordinate our security response while trying to avoid actions that could be interpreted as threatening. The military convoy arrived at our outer defensive perimeter exactly when predicted, moving with professional precision and obviously familiar with our community's layout. They had been conducting surveillance of our operations for several days, probably using satellite imagery or aerial reconnaissance. Colonel Harrison's earlier questions had been designed to confirm intelligence they already possessed. The convoy commander was Major Patricia Wong, a logistics officer who had been tasked with conducting what she called a community assessment and integration evaluation. Her mission was to determine whether Haven Valley could be incorporated into the military's regional recovery plan and what resources and personnel we could contribute to larger operations. The initial meeting with Major Wong was cordial but tense. She praised our community's organization and success in establishing sustainable operations, but made it clear that all civilian communities in the region would need to accept military coordination to ensure efficient resource utilization, and prevent conflicts. Independence was no longer an option in the new reality. Major Wang's specific demands included registration of all community members, inventory of all resources and equipment, integration of our communication systems with military networks, and acceptance of military personnel as permanent advisors for our operations. In return, the military would provide security against raider attacks, access to medical supplies and equipment, and coordination with other allied communities. The terms were reasonable on the surface, but the implications were clear. Haven Valley would become a managed community under military authority, with our leadership serving at the discretion of military commanders. Our successful autonomous operations would be integrated into a larger system where our community's needs might be subordinated to strategic military objectives. During the 3-day evaluation period, I worked closely with the military communication team to demonstrate our network capabilities and explain our coordination with other survivor communities. The military was impressed by the scope and effectiveness of our communication system, but they were also concerned about our independence and ability to operate outside their control. The military personnel were professional and generally respectful, but their presence fundamentally changed the atmosphere of our community. People were nervous and uncertain about expressing opinions or continuing normal activities. Children stopped playing freely, and adults became guarded in their conversations. The psychological impact of military occupation was immediate and significant. Maria spent considerable time treating medical issues among the military personnel, and her observations were revealing. Many of the soldiers were suffering from malnutrition, exhaustion, and stress-related health problems. Their equipment was well maintained, but their personal conditions suggested that military operations were being conducted under severe resource constraints. More significantly, Maria discovered that several soldiers were questioning their orders and the direction of military operations. There were divisions within the military hierarchy about priorities and methods, with some officers focused on humanitarian relief, while others emphasized control and security. The unity of command that Colonel Harrison had projected was not as solid as it appeared. On the 2nd day of the evaluation, we received disturbing radio reports from other communities in our network. Military units were conducting similar assessments throughout the region, and several communities had been forcibly relocated after refusing to accept military oversight. The relocations were described as voluntary consolidation for improved efficiency, but the reality appeared to be population control and resource seizure. This intelligence forced Haven Valley's leadership to accelerate our decision-making process. We could not delay indefinitely without appearing to be resistant to military authority, but accepting their terms might lead to the destruction of everything we had built. The choice was between maintaining our autonomy and risking military retaliation, or submitting to control and hoping for benevolent treatment. The debate within our leadership council was intense and sometimes heated. Dr. Martinez argued that cooperation was our only realistic option given the military's overwhelming advantages in personnel and equipment. Captain Chen countered that military control would eventually lead to the dissolution of our community, as resources were redirected to support larger strategic objectives. I found myself in the middle of these discussions, providing technical analysis of our communication, capabilities, and strategic options. My assessment was that we could maintain independent operations for several months even under military pressure, but we would eventually need external support to sustain our growth and development. The question was whether that support had to come through military channels. The breakthrough came when I received an encrypted message through our communication network from a community in Wyoming that had successfully negotiated a different arrangement with military authorities. Instead of complete integration, they had established a formal alliance that preserved their internal autonomy while providing specific services to military operations. This alliance model involved communities maintaining their independent leadership and operations while contributing specialized capabilities to regional recovery efforts. Haven Valley's communication network and technical expertise would be valuable for military coordination, but we would operate as contractors rather than subordinates. Resources and personnel would be shared through negotiated agreements rather than military requisition. I presented this alternative to Major Wang during our final meeting, using my technical credibility and communication with other military units to demonstrate that such arrangements were already working successfully in other locations. The Major was initially skeptical, but she was also under pressure to complete her assessment and move on to other assignments. The negotiation took most of the third day, with multiple radio consultations between Major Wong and her superiors. The final agreement preserved Haven Valley's internal autonomy while establishing formal cooperation protocols with military operations. We would maintain our communication network as a regional hub, provide technical services for military operations, and participate in coordinated defense against raider threats. In return, the military would provide security support when requested, facilitate trade and communication with other allied communities, and ensure access to medical supplies and equipment that we could not produce locally. Most importantly, our community would retain control over our own membership, resource allocation, and development priorities. The agreement was not perfect, and there were aspects that concerned many of our members. Military oversight of our external communications meant less privacy and potential restrictions on our contacts with non-allied communities. Requirements to provide technical support for military operations would limit our ability to focus entirely on our own development, but the alternative of forced integration or military occupation would have been much worse. We had preserved the essential character of our community while establishing relationships that would support our long-term survival and growth. It was a compromise that recognized the new realities of the post-disaster world while protecting what we had worked so hard to build. As the military convoy prepared to leave Haven Valley on my 26th day since the eruption, I reflected on how much had changed since I first climbed that tower in Colorado. I had started as an individual focused on personal survival, but had become part of a community working to rebuild civilization in a fundamentally different world. The communication network I had helped establish now connected over 50 survivor communities across 6 states, facilitating trade, mutual defense, and information sharing that was keeping thousands of people alive. My technical skills had evolved from maintaining commercial communication systems to coordinating the infrastructure that was holding together the fragments of human society. Maria had established a regional medical network that was training new healthcare workers and coordinating treatment for serious cases that required specialized facilities. Her rescue had led to saving hundreds of lives through improved medical coordination and resource sharing. The moral decision to attempt that original rescue mission had created ripple effects that extended far beyond our initial expectations. The family we had rescued was thriving in Haven Valley, with the children attending school and the parents contributing their own skills to community operations. They had become symbols of hope and proof that individual actions could make a difference even in the midst of civilizational collapse. Their survival validated every risk we had taken during the journey. But the work was far from finished. The odd, mysterious Eastern signals continued to evolve, suggesting that large-scale recovery operations were expanding throughout the region. Some of these operations appeared to be legitimate government efforts, while others showed signs of authoritarian control that could threaten communities like ours. Raider activity was also evolving, with some groups forming larger coalitions that posed serious threats to isolated communities. Our communication network was crucial for coordinating defense against these threats, but the raiders were also adapting and learning to disrupt our communications. The technological arms race between legitimate communities and hostile forces was escalating. Climate conditions remained severe, with no signs that the volcanic winter was moderating. Agricultural production was possible only in heated greenhouses, and fuel supplies for heating and transportation remained critically limited. Long-term survival would require developing sustainable energy systems and more efficient food production methods. The integration with military operations provided both opportunities and challenges for addressing these problems. Military resources could support larger-scale projects and provide security for expansion efforts, but military priorities might not always align with community needs. Managing this relationship would require constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. As I prepared my communication equipment for another day of coordinating regional operations, I realized that the role I had stumbled into was likely to be permanent. The old world of routine maintenance and commercial telecommunications was gone forever. The new world needed people who could maintain the communication links that held communities together and enabled cooperation across vast distances. The work was more important and more satisfying than anything I had done in my previous life. But it was also more dangerous and demanding. Every day brought new crises that required immediate technical solutions and strategic decisions that affected hundreds of people. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential to help rebuild something better than what had been lost. On the morning of my 30th day since the Yellowstone eruption, I climbed back up Mount Esperanza to check our high-altitude communication equipment. From that vantage point, I could see Haven Valley spread out below, with people going about their daily activities and children playing in the heated courtyards. Steam from the hot springs created clouds that caught the morning sunlight, making the community look almost magical in the harsh landscape. But I could also see beyond our valley to the wider region, where smoke columns marked other communities, and the road showed signs of continuing travel by both friendly and hostile groups. The radio traffic in my headphones carried reports of successful harvests and new community formations, but also warnings of raider attacks and resource shortages. The eastern signals remained strong and increasingly complex, suggesting that major developments were coming that would affect all of our communities. Whether these would bring opportunities for larger-scale recovery or new threats to our independence was still unclear. My network would be crucial for gathering intelligence and coordinating responses to whatever was approaching. As I adjusted the antenna arrays and updated the communication logs, I thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by the network we had built. Families reunited across hundreds of miles, medical expertise shared to save lives in remote locations, communities warned of approaching dangers, resources coordinated to prevent starvation and exposure. The infrastructure was invisible to most people, but it was the foundation that made survival possible for thousands. The world had changed forever on that October morning, when I climbed a routine maintenance tower and watched civilization collapse from 300 feet in the air. But human adaptability and cooperation had proven stronger than the disaster that struck us. Communities like Haven Valley were not just surviving, but building the foundation for whatever came next in human history.